Okay. I see the numbers increasing. People are streaming in. I'm excited to get started. But I can see you all joining. I'll wait just another moment. Hi, everybody. Okay, I think that I will officially get us started here. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah French, and I'm the Interim Executive Director for Amah Mutsun Land Trust. And on behalf of Amah Mutsun Land Trust and the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, I am very pleased to welcome you all to our virtual fire symposium. I would like to start first, as we start many of our meetings here at Amah Mutsun Land Trust, with a prayer from Chairman Valentin Lopez to get us all in the right mindset and ready to receive these messages.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for being here. Creator, we are here. Please hear our prayer. Creator, we thank you for allowing us to gather here to talk about restoring indigenous burning to landscapes, to sacred landscapes. Creator, within our territory, you gave the Amah Mutsun the responsibility to take care of Mother Earth and all living things. Creator, that's an obligation that has never been rescinded. And it's still our obligation, our moral authority to take care of these lands and to take care of them in the indigenous ways of our ancestors. Today, we'll be talking about using fire for that purpose. May those attending the session today, may they be able to understand these messages with their hearts, with their minds, with their bodies, with their spirits, Creator. And may we work together with those here today to help us find ways to bring back the traditional ways of taking care of these lands, and to help see that the knowledge of our ancestors that they developed for 12, 14, 15,000 years or more, Creator, that how important that knowledge is for us to develop sustainable ways for our foods, for our medicines, for our clean air, for our water, and for many other purposes, Creator. And we understand how indigenous people must be in a leadership position if we are to survive and deal with climate change, and if we were to get healthy together as partners. Creator, thank you. Oh.
Oh, thank you, Chairman Lopez. So due to the global health crisis, this is a virtual event, but I still would like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you all from the lands of the Yupi, the Awaswas-speaking Ohlone people whose unceded ancestral territory is now known as Santa Cruz, California. Something that I've learned through over a decade of working with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band is that every inch of land in what is now the United States was once indigenous land. So I would like to invite everyone in the webinar to enter into the chat the name of the tribe whose land that you are now occupying, if you know it. If you're not sure, my colleague Jay is putting a link in the chat to a map that might help you find out. And let us all take a moment to honor the original people of the places we now call home. I love seeing all of the names coming in. Thank you, everybody. I encourage all of us to search for ways to affirm Indigenous sovereignty and to hold ourselves accountable to the needs of Indigenous people today. One lesson that we will affirm over and over again in our webinar is that Indigenous people are not gone. They're still here, and there is a lot that they can teach us about how to live in the world and how to take care of Mother Earth. And we need to listen. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy lives today to listen. We're here to learn about fire and specifically to learn more about Indigenous burning in the Central Coast of California. Seems like each year we're seeing more and more catastrophic wildfires throughout California. This year, wildfires in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Diablo Range severely impacted parts of Amah Mutsun tribal band territory. The CZU lightning complex fires in the Santa Cruz Mountains burned through our Native Stewardship Corps program headquarters at Cascade Ranch in August. Thankfully, our Native stewards were able to safely evacuate, but we lost years of accumulated tools and equipment when our tool shed burned to the ground. And the fires damaged infrastructure so that the housing that our Native stewards have used is now uninhabitable. And we know that many people lost their homes and livelihoods in these fires. And if this is you, please know that our hearts and our prayers are with you, and they have been with you. We also pray for the animal and the plant relatives that suffered. And we mourn that in some places the land will suffer for many years to come as a result of these fires. We're having this symposium today because we want people to know that if the land was under the care of Indigenous people who were allowed to practice their cultural burning traditions, these catastrophic wildfires would not have happened. And if Indigenous cultural burning is promoted and restored to the landscape, these kinds of catastrophic fires don't have to happen again. Today, we're going to hear from a panel of esteemed experts who will help us see fire from a new perspective. I'm grateful to each of them for being generous with their time and their knowledge today. And again, I'm grateful to all of you who have joined us. We're up to 615 participants, which is incredible to me. Thank you. And before we dive into our presentations, I'd like to go over just a few logistics. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to access it in the days to come on our website at amahmutsunlandtrust.org/videos. Second, we are unable to take questions during this webinar. However, we invite you to enter your questions using the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer your questions in future communications from Amah Mutsun Land Trust, for example, via our newsletter. And you can sign up to receive our newsletter, receive these communications by email at amahmutsunlandtrust.org/subscribe. That link is also in the chat. Third, I'd like to share that this event is being funded in part through a grant from the California State Coastal Conservancy with cap and trade funding from California Climate Investments. We're grateful to the Coastal Conservancy for their support and also grateful to all of our grant partners and individual donors who make our work possible. To all of our supporters out there in the audience right now listening, thank you so much. And with that, I have the great pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Chairman Valentin Lopez. Chairman Lopez has been the elected leader of the Amah Mutsun tribal band since 2003. Under Chairman Lopez's leadership, the Amah Mutsun tribal band created the Amah Mutsun Land Trust. Towards the end of the symposium, I will be giving an overview of the Amah Mutsun Land Trust and our new Cultural Burns program. But first, Chairman Lopez will provide some essential background information about the Amah Mutsun tribal band's land stewardship traditions, and specifically the importance of fire to the Amah Mutsun. So without further ado, I will pass the virtual mic on to Chairman Valentin Lopez of the Amah Mutsun tribal band.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And once again, thanks you to all who are attending today's session. I always start most of my talks by talking about our creation story. Our creation story takes place at Mount Umunhum, which was the tallest mountain in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Their creator gave our tribe, created our tribe, and then he clearly defined what our territory. And then he gave us a responsibility to take care of Mother Earth and all living things within that territory. One of the things that we received from Creator as a gift, as a sacred gift, was fire. Well, let me say also that we recognize that responsibility in a very serious way. We recognize it as a sacred covenant with Creator, telling us that, you know, why we're here, what we must do. And we recognize that the Mother Earth was sacred, and it was our responsibility to maintain that sacredness on these lands. We also recognize that fire was given to us as a gift from Creator. And it was a very important gift. That gift allowed us to it provided warmth for our people, for all people. It allowed us to cook our foods. It allowed us to have light in the darkness. It is very important for our ceremonies and for our dance. Most of you know that before we pray, we'll smudge ourselves to purify us, to bless us. And then we'll pray and we'll hold an abalone shell. We pray into the sacred smoke. And that smoke carries our prayers and our words and up to Creator. But not only carries the prayers and our words, but it carries the prayers that are in our hearts and in our minds and our bodies. It carries those messages up and lets the Creator know our needs for healing, our needs for to deal with our anxieties and to take care of our families, etc. Those prayers are clearly held when the smoke carries them up. All of our ceremonies, we have a fire in the center of our ceremonies. And that fire right there is to receive the prayers from all the people that are attending the ceremonies and carrying those prayers up, the prayers for healing and for renewal and for help with their families, their children, their elders, etc. And fire is also a tool for managing landscapes. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Most non-Indigenous people see fire as something to be afraid of and something that is destructive. For many years, the practice has been to extinguish the fire as soon as possible. And fire is feared. And as we learned recently, the fire is very damaging, very damaging. And then we pray for those who were harmed. It's much different to Indigenous people. To Indigenous people, it's not feared. The central coast of California was recognized as the most biodiverse landscape in North America. Was one of the most biodiverse landscapes in North America. And it was a coastal prairie. And our people would burn that landscape, and they would look at a landscape and divide it into segments. And they would divide it into 5, 6, 7 segments or more. And they would burn one segment per year. And then after that last one, they'd start that rotation all over. And that was a very important way of managing the resources and taking care of Mother Earth. It kept the tremendous fuel loads from building up. It allowed, it kept the fuel loads from building up. And the fires that they did have, they were very low intensity. They did not get super hot. They didn't sterilize the ground. And they also creeped along very slowly. So they're very easy to manage and to watch over. Whenever they would burn that way, using that segments, that first year burn, that was important because, as I said, it was a coastal prairie, and so you had a lot of seed plants, and in those grasslands, and fire is important to help seeds germinate And so after a fire, you would get very heavy and an abundance of seeds there. And that was a wonderful way to take care of the birds who are seed eaters. And it would also take care of the other animals who relied on seeds as their foods. And it also, it took care of people. At time, seasonally, our diets would be 40% seed. So it was a very important food source for our people as well. The second year growth, you'd get these higher shoots coming out of the ground. And those higher shoots were the preferred foods and the favorite foods of the grazing animals, the antelope, the deer, the elk, and others. And the second year growth, those shoots are soft and juicy and moist and just delicious. And as I said, they were the preferred foods. That third year growth, you start getting plants that were more bushy. And those were important food plants. Those right there provided our leafy vegetables and other things such as berries, etc. That bushiness was important also because they provided the materials for a lot of basketry. They allowed cordages where you can do weaving because they were soft and pliable. They were easy to work, and they could develop traps and netting, etc. That fourth, fifth, and sixth years, those other years, you start getting heavier and heavier materials, and those were all important for various purposes. It could be for housing, it could be for clothing, it could be for bows, for bow and arrows, it could be for other kinds of crafting needs, for tools, etc. Each year, they would burn one segment, and at the end, they would start all over. And that ensured a balance of the resources. It ensured that we were taking care of the deer, the elk, the birds, and the mice, and the rabbits, etc. Those were all a very important way of taking care of the resources and of fulfilling our obligation to take care of Mother Earth and all living things. Then came the brutal period and the first period of our colonization. And that was the mission Spanish period. Whenever the missions came in, one of the early things they did was they outlawed fire. It was in 1778 that the missions outlawed indigenous burning. And in Santa Cruz, where that beautiful coastal prairie was, what happened is that when you took the fire away, you had these shrubs starting to encroach. And then you get these larger trees, and first the Doug fir and other trees, and then the redwoods that come in. Today, the majority of that coastal prairie is gone. And there's very little grasslands now within the central coast of California. And that biodiversity that existed there is gone as well. It's pretty much gone as well. It's interestingly, not interesting, sadly, the fire was also outlawed during the Mexican period. And as I'm sure you know today, fire is outlawed during the California American period. And so, you know, indigenous burning has not happened in well over 200 years. Today, the Amah Mutsun are working to restore that coastal prairie. And a lot of our work is happening in the Quiroste Valley Cultural Preserve, which is part of the Año Nuevo State Park. What we're doing is we're cutting down trees and then bringing back and restoring native plants. Interestingly, today, our stewards are in the field working with state parks and others, burning a particular landscape in Quiroste Valley. We hope to be able to, what we want to do is we want to return the biodiversity and bring back our food plants and the medicine plants and the basketry plants. The landscapes, when that came in, our animals, the the wildlife um, are, their food supply has been greatly impacted too. Once they brought in the European grasses, grazing grasses, and the other European plants and stuff like that, they quickly overtook our native plants. And so the same way the Native Americans are, we're having a hard time. Well, we've had a very difficult time adjusting to these new foods. And that's shown in the areas of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, etc. The animals suffer too. They're eating plants that their digestive systems are not used to. So it's important that we bring back our native plants. And another benefit of the way that we use to burn on that regular basis is that it rebuilds topsoil. We have a problem today. I read a report not that long ago where it said there's only 60 years of topsoil left. And after that, there's going to be a lot of issues with starvation for the people. So we need to start thinking about how do we rebuild and restore that topsoil. And so the way that we are talking about today will actually achieve that. So there's a lot of other information, but I was trying to be very specific here on for today. So I'll end my talk there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chairman Lopez. It's always a great honor to hear you share a little bit about the approach of the Amah Mutsun and your history and the goals for today. Thank you. And I did just want to emphasize again that today, at this moment, Native stewards are doing a prescribed burn alongside state parks, burning the coastal prairie that you see in this picture. So that's a very exciting synergy that is happening today. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Kent Lightfoot and Dr. Rob Cuthrell. Dr. Kent Lightfoot is a professor in the Anthropology department at the University of California, Berkeley. He has undertaken archaeological work around the United States, and his recent investigations have focused on the archaeology of colonialism, the shell mounds of the greater San Francisco Bay Area, and indigenous landscape stewardship practices along the central coast of California. Dr. Lightfoot is co-author of the book, California Indians and Their Environment, an Introduction. And Dr. Lightfoot is also on the Amah Mutsun Land Trust Board of Directors, and he's worked alongside the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band for many years to support the tribe's cultural revitalization and relearning efforts. Dr. Cuthrell uses archaeological and historical ecological approaches to study the history of prescribed burning by Native people on California's Central Coast. Dr. Cuthrell received his Ph.D. from UC Berkeley in 2013, studying with Dr. Lightfoot, and carried out 4 years of postdoctoral research at Berkeley that included acting as a collaborative resource stewardship liaison between the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band and public agencies in the tribe's territory. Dr. Cuthrell also served as Director of Archaeological Resource Management for Amah Mutsun Land Trust from 2015 to 2020. And he has been supporting the Amah Mutsun Land Trust as a research associate since the organization's inception and actually before. So with that, I will pass the mic on to Dr. Cuthrell and Dr. Lightfoot.
Thanks, Sarah. Hey, it's a great honor to be here today. I'll begin our talk. And I want to begin by stating that Rob and I, we acknowledge that we live here in the lands of the Chochinyo Ohlone peoples. And what we want to do today is talk about our collaborative research program that's with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, the Amah Mutsun Land Trust, but it involves archaeologists, ecologists, and other scholars from UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, California State Parks, and other entities. And the purpose of this program is to enhance our understanding of indigenous landscape stewardship practices, and more specifically today, about how fire was used constructively by Native peoples here in Central California. And to really structure our research program talk today, I'll reiterate a few points that Val eloquently talked about. The first is just, why tribal peoples burn. There are many reasons, as Val talked about, clearing the undergrowth, removing detritus, controlling insects, facilitating game hunting. But really a key reason was to augment productivity of economic plants and animals in their tribal territories. And how did people burn? I think, Rob, this will be our, basically people instigated anthropological fire regimes characterized by frequent, small, low severity surface burns. Rob's running my slides here today. And next slide, Rob. And as Val talked about, they would burn a series of small patches across the territories of their tribes and create this patchy mosaic of vegetation stands, which facilitated the growth and succession of different biological communities, such as coastal prairies that Val talked about, berry patches, hazelnuts, etc. The outcomes, next slide, Rob, were to increase the quantity, diversity, and sustainability of the plants and animals used by Native peoples for foods, medicines, materials for baskets and other crafts, and dance regalia. And also minimize the risk of major fires. By burning in a patchwork mosaic that Val talked about, they would have reduced fuel loads and broken up the landscape into different habitat types, possibly creating fuel breaks, particularly after recent burns. Next slide, Rob. Our research team is addressing 3 questions. One, the first is, what is the earliest physical evidence for sustained cultural burning along the central California coast? And how did it change over time? The second is, how did these practices influence local biological communities? And what kinds of plants and animals benefited from the cultural burning? And then the third question is, at what scale was cultural burning implemented along the central California coast? Our ultimate goal is to explore how lessons from the past may provide useful information for contemporary management of our open spaces, such as enhancing the richness and diversity of native species, maintaining high levels of landscape productivity and heterogeneity, and reducing fuel loads and minimizing the risk of these major fires that are plaguing us today. Our investigation of indigenous cultural burning is informed by multiple sources of information. One is native oral traditions and tribal histories, ethnohistorical accounts, early explorers who observed fires. Rob will talk about this for the Portola Expedition today. Early ethnography by anthropologists in the early 1900s who worked with tribes, particularly in this area, John Harrington from the Smithsonian Institution. Fire ecology, fire scar studies, palynology, my colleague Scott Stevens will talk, I think, a little bit about that today. And then what we'll really focus on is eco-archaeology, where we are recovering plant and animal remains and associated artifacts from a suite of sites in the Amah Mutsun tribal territory that date back 7,000 years all the way up to historic times. We began our study back in 2007 in the Año Nuevo State Park, the Quiroste Valley Cultural Preserve that Val mentioned. And we have since then investigated other study areas on the central California coast. Now, in summarizing our results, we have found strong evidence for sustained indigenous cultural burning. Our findings suggest that indigenous communities were using fire to create and sustain coastal prairies for many centuries. Our work further suggests that the maintenance of these productive coastal grasslands that we see would have required frequent burning on the order of once every few years. Furthermore, it appears that these indigenous landscape stewardship practices were employed across an extensive area along the central California coast based on our work. We are currently exploring with the tribe and the Amah Mutsun Land Trust, California State Parks, and other resource agencies, how these findings may be incorporated into ecological restoration and fire management programs today. And keeping in mind that these are rooted in the deep history of tribal practices going back many centuries. I'm now delighted to turn our talk over to Rob Cuthrell, who's going to discuss the latest findings of our program. And I think he'll focus in on 4 specific sites. So Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Kent. And thanks so much for all of you for attending the talk today, and for Amah Mutsun Land Trust for organizing it. So as Kent mentioned, we looked at many different lines of evidence in our study, and today I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. The first is historical documents from the Portola Expedition, and second, archaeological information about the types of plants that people were eating in the past from these 4 archaeological sites. So the Portola Expedition of 1769 was the first overland Spanish expedition into Upper California. And the purpose of this expedition was to relocate the port of Monterey, as well as to scout out locations for establishing presidios and missions as part of their efforts to expand the Spanish colonial empire. And as part of this expedition, there were 3 diarists who recorded the journey. And one diarist in particular, Juan Crespi, was a priest who kept a very detailed record of the type of vegetation that they were seeing each day, the water quality, the soil quality, what types of timber they were seeing, because he's always thinking about where's the best place to set up missions. And so part of the work that I did for my dissertation was going back through these diaries and doing the best I could to reconstruct the routes of the expedition, and then creating maps to depict the type of vegetation and the condition of vegetation that they were seeing that might tell us something about how Native people were managing these landscapes and what the fire regime was like. So as Chairman Lopez and Kent Lightfoot mentioned, our expectation is that under a natural fire regime without indigenous burning, fires would be infrequent because lightning in this area is fairly rare. This set of fires that we had ignited over the summer in the Santa Cruz Mountains this year, that was a very rare event. It's much more typical to go for many, many decades and have very few lightning ignited fires in the Santa Cruz Mountains region, especially along these coastal areas. So in those conditions, we would expect to see a landscape dominated by shrublands and grasslands. But on the other hand, if indigenous people were burning frequently with these low intensity fires, we would expect to see extensive coastal prairies like Chairman Lopez was describing. So what this map is showing is my reconstruction of the route of the Portola expedition going up the coast, and the colors to each side of the line represent the type of vegetation that they reported seeing. This map is meant to be interpreted schematically rather than literally, so the extent of the colors is just meant to represent what they could probably see while they were traveling along. And so the light green color here is grassland, the bluish color here is shrublands, the reddish color is redwood forest, and then other vegetation types are fairly minor. And then you'll see that some of these vegetation types are stippled with these little triangles. And those are the areas where the expedition members recorded burning on that particular day. So to give you an idea of what these diary entries looked like, October 24th, we set out at 9:15 in the morning from here at the village on a due northward course in view of the shore over very big high ranges of knolls, all burnt off, having very good soil, all of them bare of trees. It was only in the gaps between the knolls that we could see the white range of mountains in the back, continuing, still overgrown with the redwood trees met before.
Excuse me, Rob, we're hearing some crackling and people are having trouble hearing you. Not sure if something might be touching your microphone.
I'm sorry, I'll try and hold it away from my jacket. I think that's what it was.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, everybody. So as we continue northward along the coast, the expedition is going up toward the San Francisco Peninsula, and they continue to see extensive grasslands in the coastal areas with a lot of burning, the stippling. And they go down through the San Andreas Valley and they come out around Palo Alto, where they make camp for about a week. And there they say that there's extensive oak woodlands where the understory is burned off. And again, we get a sense of the lack of the lack of woody vegetation in these areas. So around Half Moon Bay, they wrote, we set out at about 9 o'clock in the morning from here. Hold on. From here on a northwestward course along the shore, close to which run tablelands and rolling knolls, burnt off, with very good soil. Close to this point would be a very good spot for a town. However, there is not a stick of wood anywhere about here, so that it was necessary to pack it from the preceding spot where there was some on the stream. So we can get the sense from these diaries that by the onset of Spanish colonization in the late 1700s, the burning, the prescribed burning that Native people had been doing for a long time had substantially transformed the landscape vegetation, and all of these areas along the coast that would have naturally turned into shrublands or forests were instead being maintained as these diverse and productive coastal prairies through indigenous burning. And so, like Professor Lightfoot mentioned, we also wanted to investigate the antiquity of burning practices. And so in order to do that, we have to use archaeological approaches. And so now I'm going to talk about archaeobotanical or macrobotanical analysis, which is where we sample soils from archaeological sites to extract charred plant remains that tell us about the types of plants that people were using for food and fuel. So in order to do this, we take a sample of soil, we put it in this device called a flotation tank and stir it around. And all of the charred botanical materials float to the top and go out through the spout where they're collected in these screens. And then the other material, like the bones and the rocks and shells, will sink to the bottom. And all of this gets taken back to the laboratory and analyzed separately to learn more about the types of natural resources that Native people were using. So here's just a photograph of what this light fraction material of the plant remains looks like. And here's how we identify the plants. So here on the left, we have tarweed, which is a fairly common coastal plant that was a very important seed food for Native people throughout coastal California. And up at the top right, we can see photographs of modern examples of the seeds of this plant. It's a plant in the sunflower family, and you can see that the seeds look a lot like sunflower seeds. Down at the bottom right, you can see examples of the archaeological charred seeds of this plant. So the way that we identify these archaeological ones is just by comparing it with examples of the modern ones and, you know, finding the plant that has the seed shape that fits. So we did this type of analysis at 8 different archaeological sites, and today I'm just going to talk about 4 of them. These are sites that were a little bit inland of the coast. And so these 4 sites, SCR10, SMA 113, SCR 15, and SCR 14, they range in age from a little over 1,000 years ago up to just several hundred years ago. And what this chart is showing is up here on the y-axis is the percentage of each of these different types of plants that are listed along the bottom. And so they're divided into categories. We have the category of edible nuts, edible grassland seed foods, fruits, and then other taxa, which could be medicinal plants, or it could just be plants that incidentally became incorporated into fires or were burned. And so what we can see straight off is that the largest proportions of plant remains that we see in these archaeological sites are coming from the grassland seed foods, mostly from the grasses themselves. So this column represents the proportion of grass seeds that we're seeing in these archaeological sites, followed by panicled bulrush, which is a wetland potential seed food, tarweed, and native clover seeds. So in contrast, the proportions of edible nuts tend to be relatively low. We see very little acorn or tan oak or California bay. We see fairly substantial amounts of hazelnut nutshell, but it doesn't come close to equaling what we see in terms of the grassland seed foods. So one thing I'll mention is that just because we don't see a lot of acorns at these sites, it doesn't mean that Native people weren't eating acorns. It probably just means that when they were processing and harvesting acorns, they were living further up in the mountains in sites that we haven't investigated. So what these data are showing us is that there's not a great deal of evidence for a widespread forest or shrubland type of landscape that would have produced a lot of nuts during this period from more than 1,000 years ago up into a few hundred years ago. But there's very good evidence and consistent evidence at all of these inland sites that we've looked at for extensive grasslands that native people were harvesting seed foods from. And we think that these grasslands only could have become extensive and been maintained extensively through indigenous prescribed burning. The other lines of evidence that we look at also support this interpretation, things like looking at the types of wood that people were using for fuel and looking at soil constituents that record soil history and landscape vegetation history. So thanks again very much for joining our symposium today. That's all I have to present for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Cuthrell and Dr. Lightfoot. I just remember learning about this for the first time and being so impressed the evidence that people can pull together to really document the fact that indigenous burning was happening on a frequent scale in California, in the central coast of California. And I'm also excited to report that the Amah Mutsun Land Trust Native Stewardship Corps is in the process of taking this research and turning it into stewardship work on the ground, and that's what they're doing today. So next, we will move on to a presentation from Dr. Scott Stevens. Dr. Stevens is a professor of fire science in the Department of Environmental Science Policy and Management at UC Berkeley. Dr. Stevens is interested in the interactions of wildland fire and ecosystems. This includes how prehistoric fires once interacted with ecosystems and how current wildland fires are affecting ecosystems, and how future fires, management, and climate change will impact the ecosystems of Western North America. Dr. Stevens is also interested in wildland fire and forest policy and how it can be improved to meet the challenges of the next decade. Dr. Stevens has published over 200 journal articles and is considered a leading scholar in the field of fire ecology. So let's please welcome him virtually, Dr. Stevens.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you virtually. I want to acknowledge that I presently live on Ohlone land. I live in the East Bay here in California. And today it's my pleasure to talk at this conference and to talk about kind of fire history and also a new research project that I want to chat with you about here at the end of the talk. Hopefully you can see my first slide. On the right, you see big old redwood tree, one of the classic beautiful trees of California. On the left is actually a huge oracle oak. And this is actually in San Vicente Reserve in Santa Cruz. And I'm gonna talk a lot more about that reserve in a moment. But that particular oak, it's actually just amazing. I think it's over 5 feet in diameter. It's one of the largest oaks I've ever seen in California. And in fact, there's a whole group of these oaks in San Vicente. And I think really a legacy of indigenous management and a place of great power, I think. When I go there, it just gives me incredible energy just to see that place and think of its history. So we'll talk about that some more in a moment. So redwood, redwood is a beautiful tree, one that I think a lot of us love to recreate in. It's one of the most fire adapted conifers in North America. In fact, it's almost very, very difficult to actually kill a redwood, completely kill it with a fire because of some of its characteristics. Certainly it's tall. We know it is classified as the tallest tree in the world today. Some of the trees in parts of redwood country are over 300 feet tall. And certainly just having such a tall individual will just take fire away from the crown of the tree and then less chance of harming it. So just being tall gives you an advantage from a fire ecology standpoint. Certainly redwood has thick bark And the bark is very insulative to the cambium layer, the meristem tissue right underneath the bark that is necessary for growth. And one thing that's amazing about redwood, it resprouts after fire, both from the bole or the stem of the tree and also from the entire base of the tree. So it has this ability to resprout in two mechanisms. That's very unusual for any conifer. There's a few conifers in the United States that do this. One is big cone Douglas fir. But when you look really worldwide, there are not many conifers that have this ability to resprout after defoliation from fire. And the other thing is redwood has tremendous resistance to rot and insects, and that just provides a very, very strong structural support for the tree to persist in our ecosystems. I wanted to show just one photograph of fire in redwood. This one, I did not take this picture, and you'll see the person that did below. But I've actually worked on some redwood prescribed fires. And you can see, as Chairman Lopez says, you're looking at a fire with low intensity here. Flame length's probably 6 to 10 inches tall, burning through a redwood stand. I think this would be very typical of the way redwood used to burn for millennia in coastal California. Sometimes people think, well, why would redwood burn? It's too wet. You know, it's just a place that's always near fog and on the coast. All that's true, of course. But we live in a Mediterranean climate, and there's no doubt there's opportunities for this redwood to burn. And it did. I'll show you some data of that here in a moment. Here are some pictures of the response of redwood to high severity fire. This turns out to be right from the CZU complex fire that we've been hearing about that burned in Santa Cruz this year. On the right, you can see the redwood shoots resprouting from the base of a tree. So the top of the tree was killed by the fire, but the base of the tree now is already regenerating. This is from August. So that tree is putting out all sorts of new shoots as it begins to grow again. And on the left is one of the more unique pieces of redwood too, the ability of the tree to resprout along the stem. Again, a very, very unusual characteristic of a conifer. So this is a particular area of the CZU complex fire that burned with high severity. And we were out there luckily about a week ago just to visit, to take a look at the site. And we saw many redwoods doing this. Of course, redwoods have another legacy, and this picture kind of shows it. A lot of areas have been logged over the years. There still are old growth forest in redwood, but it's not a very large proportion any longer. This photograph is from San Mateo County and right adjacent to Santa Cruz County in the early 1800s. We see a logging operation with oxen and taking logs off the mountain. Of course, redwood is an incredible lumber, and a lot of areas have been harvested historically, and this has had a large impact to these ecosystems, to say the least. And when we look at a lot of redwood forests today, we see more of this character. This is I would say, a young growth redwood forest. Trees here are probably maybe 60, 70, 80, 100 years old. It was harvested in the past, and you can see maybe in the right foreground, there's a stump there, and you see some trees around it that have resprouted, and over those decades have gotten larger and larger. But when you look at this from a fire perspective, you can see a relatively high density of trees in this redwood forest, and you also have quite a bit of dead and down fuel. So the fuel conditions here are actually quite high. And I think a lot of people thought that, redwood forest, which is probably a little bit immune from high severity fire. I think in some ways that's not a crazy idea, but of course we know this year with the CZU complex and some other fires that have occurred in Humboldt State Park and others, that fire can get into these systems and cause great effects. What about fire history? This is something I've enjoyed doing in my lab for a couple of decades. You can see in the left there is an old redwood stump, probably harvested in those late 1800s or maybe even the early 1900s. And we've taken that chainsaw and we started to cut the stump apart, and we're looking for fire scars. A fire scar is simply a lesion left in the wood from the injury of a fire. So the fire comes along and burns the base of the tree. Some places the bark is maybe too thin, or maybe there's a previous damage there or a previous fire scar. And then you have that temperature increase and kill the cambium layer. Rule of thumb says 60 degrees centigrade for 1 minute will kill any living plant tissue. Could be a root, could be a leaf, could be the cambium layer. So we have this ability then today to go into these trees, into the stumps primarily, take samples, and then we can date and get the idea of past fire frequency inside these trees. And one thing I always get excited about in Redwood, as Rob Cuthrell mentioned, we don't usually get much lightning fire in the coast Redwood region. So when you have a fire scar in your hand, you know that is from a person. That's an indigenous burning history. I always think that's an exciting thing, is to think of people managing that land. And here's the physical evidence right here. We did a study in the Santa Cruz Mountains, the northeastern Santa Cruz Mountains, a number of years ago. And we took a bunch of fire scars, like the one I just showed you a moment ago. And then we looked at the intervals between fires. So what's the interval in terms of years between fires? And what you're seeing there essentially is the interval 10, 20, 30 years between fires recorded in the tree rings, and then the number of times that was actually found in the collection. So pretty good distribution of fires with an average mean of around 12 years, a median of about 10. One thing about Redwood that's kind of interesting, it's a little bit perplexing, is that the tree ring structure of Redwood is very, very hard to use in terms of trying to date. It's not uniform. Most trees like ponderosa pine, other species have a very high autocorrelation between growth patterns in individuals. It turns out for some reason, Redwood doesn't do that. Redwood's got its own mind. So it becomes more difficult to give calendar dates to the fire scars versus other species in California, but you can still attempt to do it. But here, so we got many, many fires recorded right around 10 years interval or so from the study that we did in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We were able to find only 2 live trees with a fire scar. So the graph on the bottom, you see the calendar year, 1500 to 2000, and you see 2 lines that are above that are horizontal. The lines are 2 individual cookies that we cut out of a live tree. We didn't take the tree down, we just were able to take a sample out of a live tree. And every one of the vertical tick marks that are black are a fire scar. And here we dated those as best we could, even though there is a challenge with the tree rings. But still, you can see that these 2 samples show a fire history from about 1615, with the last fire, we think about 1884. And the median interval about 7.5 years. So this is a record that goes back a couple, 300 years, showing really indigenous burning on this land. And again, exciting to see how often fire occurred in these systems. This is at Huddard Park in San Mateo, just above Stanford University, where I did a study there a number of years ago. And this fire history data in Redwood is still out there to be collected today. There's a lot of it out there, and I'll show you in a moment some other studies that have looked at this, but there is an ability to get more information about past fire occurrence. I wanted to put this one slide in here showing the distribution of Redwood, which is the dark colors, and each of those little arrows and each box shows you a fire history that's been done and published. So you see, like number 1, 8-year interval average, number 2, 11 to 44 years. Number 4, 6 to 22 years. So essentially what we see here is the culmination of a bunch of fire history studies in Redwood, and they all show fire intervals of around 10 years or so. And this is no doubt indigenous burning up and down that whole California coast. So the summary is Redwood used to burn quite often. The lightning fires in 2020 were very unusual. The record, I think, shows us that they're profoundly fire adapted. One thing I would say for sure, though, is the Redwood fire history is actually just a subset of the fires that were used in those landscapes. We know from prescribed burning, if you try to do a prescribed fire in coast redwood forest and humidity gets above 50%, it's very difficult to burn because it's just too moist. I think what this tells us is a lot of burning was occurring in oak woodlands and other vegetation types that never got into the redwood to get actually recorded in the tree rings. So this is just a subsample of the fires that were done. I think there's a lot more going on in terms of fire for indigenous purposes that are not recorded in the tree rings. What about some oak woodlands and other vegetation types that are coastal California? Well, here's a picture of an oak woodland that I took recently. You can see it's high surface fuels, high density. It's an area that hasn't had any burning for, I would say, probably 50 years or more. Very, very hazardous. The next picture is a mixed hardwood forest. We got California Bay in here. We've got even a little bit of Douglas fir, different oak species. I would say very typical in coastal California today, with very little fire for a long time, and frankly, a pretty darn hazardous fuel bed. Here's an interesting picture I always like to show of cultural burning done by the Amah Mutsun in the San Vicente Reserve, reducing fuels and performing land stewardship. So showing that, you know, bringing fire back to the land is integral to the conservation of these systems. I think a lot of people have thought of the coastal ecosystems as not as departed, probably in their structural characteristics, say as a Sierra Nevada mixed conifer or the Ponderosa pine forest. I actually think they're just as departed. I just think there hasn't been as much recognition of how much departure there's been because of the lack of fire. Here's a couple of pictures from San Vicente. And the one on the left is a little sad. That's a redwood forest that was there, and it's still there, and burned with high severity when the CZU complex fire. You can see on the right, though, that that tree is already starting to resprout from the bowl. So that redwood forest will come back, even though it looks horrific on that left picture. There will be a forest there again, but there's been damage, severe damage to soil, erosion potential. That is not necessary in an indigenous management paradigm, okay? That type of fire just would not have burned in that kind of condition. We just didn't have the fuel beds available to do what it did in the CZU complex. Here's another area of the San Vicente mixed hardwood forest. And we see here that most of these trees have all been top killed, and they're already resprouting from the base. There's a madrone there, there's some other species. Again, high severity fire, and again, indigenous management would have prevented this from happening. So another reason why it's so important for us to continue to think about the conservation and stewardship of these lands. One more picture from that reserve is an area of moderate severity fire. Here we see some of the overstory survived, the understory burned. So there is a lot of variation out there in fire effects. Many of you have probably seen some of these areas, and there's great variation. This place has still got a lot of live trees, and the crowns of these trees still intact. Here's my last slide, talking about the new research project. We were fortunate to get a CAL FIRE competitive grant to work in San Vicente, work with the Amah Mutsun, actually in the corps, and also tribal leadership to work together as a team to come up with ideas to bring fire back to the land, learn about traditional use of fire, and then maybe expand that to other places in California. We're right now with Nadia Hamey working to actually find experimental plots where we're going to do canopy cover reduction to try to get open stands with oaks, maybe medium density stands with oaks, and then relatively dense stands of oaks. That way having a gradient of light on the surface of the ground. Really trying to work to get more light on the ground for some understory plant development and other factors. So we're going to replicate that 3 times, each unit about 25 acres. And we're already thinking about the second fire. You know, this first fire's done some work for us, but we need to keep it going. We have to keep that fire on the land back. Just like Val talked about, this is something that goes on, frankly, forever. And it's something that we've lost, and we got to get back. So I'd say it's time for innovation and restoration using indigenous knowledge. I think this should happen up and down the state. I think we're really ripe for that opportunity if the tribes choose to work with us. I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens. That was a great presentation. I really appreciated that graph of the fire return intervals in redwood forests across the entire state. That was really illuminating. Thanks for sharing that info with us. So I'm going to move on to our next presentation. We have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Don Hankins. Dr. Hankins is a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at California State University, Chico. He's also field director for the CSU Chico Ecological Reserves. His areas of expertise are pyrogeography, water resources, and conservation. Dr. Hankins is a Plains Miwok traditional cultural practitioner. Combining his academic and cultural interests, he's particularly interested in the application of indigenous land management practices as a keystone process to aid in conservation and management of resources. He's currently engaged in fire and water research involving Indigenous California and Aboriginal Australian communities. Dr. Hankins has been involved in various aspects of land management and conservation for a variety of organizations and agencies, including federal and tribal governments. Dr. Hankins lives in a rural area, so he pre-recorded his presentation for us. And I'll ask you to wait just a moment while my colleague, Allie, gets that video going.
You to the Amah Mutsun Land Trust for the opportunity to participate in this afternoon's panel. Today I'll be talking about Indigenous fire stewardship in Central California. My name is Don Hankins, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at California State University, Chico. And I'm Muko, which means I'm Plains Miwok from the Delta region in Central California. Today I'll be sharing a little bit about the context of Indigenous fire in our region, the stories that we have around fire, but also the application of fire in our various ecosystems. In our stories, we have a knowledge about fires that goes back to beginning of time. And when we think about the extent of fires in what I'll call the first fire stories, these are fires that burned over the entire landscape, wreaking havoc on our ecosystems and upheaving our communities. From that story, what we have is the opportunity to learn how to use fire within our landscapes. And I think about that in the context of the world that we're living in today, the fires that we're seeing, the impacts of these fires, and the point that we've not been able to steward our landscapes as our ancestors have. Today, we have the opportunity to move forward, to build a better relationship with the landscape. And that's what I'll be sharing with you today, is that understanding of our sacred knowledge of fire that is part of our landscape. To begin with, I'd like to just highlight the story. That's important to understand this context, the spiritual relationship of fire within our landscape and the world that we live in. And when I think about this, one great example of that is the story from the Portola Expedition traveling up the Pajaro River Valley and entering into what would have been an Amah Mutsun village where the condor ceremony was taking place. They observed a landscape that had been burned. And so that relationship of fire within the landscape, a landscape that's been loved, that's been tended to, is something that these early Spanish explorers came into contact with. And there's so many multifaceted reasons for why that fire was taking place. But in this context, we think about the sacred nature of the condor and the ceremony that's being held. To think about the cultural context of burning, there's a lot of different reasons why California Indians have used fire. And Henry Lewis, the anthropologist, has done a lot of research in the 1970s looking at the various reasons, and he found over 73 reasons why California Indians burned. Amongst those are things like maintaining travel corridors, game management, conservation, and I think about this in particular to thinking about like biodiversity and protection of our built environment. We also think about water stewardship, maintaining water temperatures and flow within our streams and those sorts of things. Then there's landscape cleanup, just burning to get rid of accumulated fuels and things like that. And then the specific management for food, medicine, and fiber plants. And it's been said by Martin and Sapsis and others that the frequent burning of the landscape by California Indians created a landscape mosaic which created and maintained biodiversity. Our knowledge of the landscape is quite detailed. And I remember one of my elders back in the early 2000s sharing with me a story from one of her elders going back to the early 1900s. And that saying was that if people stopped burning, wildfires would become rampant. And that if you use fire, that if you light fires, that you know that you will bring the rain. And I think about that in the context of the fires that we're seeing today and how we have stopped burning and that wildfires are becoming rampant. And that if we know how and when to use fire within the landscape, we can also bring the rain and those kind of things, which are part of our traditional knowledge systems. Our landscape's really out of whack. And this series of photos here really helps to illustrate some of the changes that have taken place within our landscape. The top photos are from the area of Forest Ranch in the Lassen foothills, and actually the area where I live in. In this photograph on the left, you see the 1930s shot by Wieslander, and we see a foothill vegetation community that's pretty open. It's got chaparral, it's got some oak woodlands, it's got some grasslands, and it's got some mixed conifer forest. And what we notice is that on the right-hand side, the 2018 photo, that a lot of these open grassland, open woodland systems have been encroached upon by woody vegetation becoming very thick, which changes the fire behavior within the system. And this is a place that hasn't seen a large fire in the last 120 years. Contrast that to the lower pictures, which are from Yosemite Valley. 1866, we see the Merced River and the valley floor itself with the open meadow ecosystem with lots of oaks and some scattered conifers mixed in there. But jump forward to 1994 and we see that the meadow's been encroached upon by those conifers. We've lost a lot of the oaks, and the conifers are so dense that fire behavior would be very different in this particular system. And so the point is that frequent burning by California Indians across our regions have really created landscapes that were much more resilient to fire and resistant to the types of fires that we are seeing today. To think about that in a socio-ecological scaling, I put together this graphic to think about things from the individual plant scale all the way to the ecoregion, or if we want to think about it in terms of the built environment, a single structure to a town or city or a region, and the scales of fires that we see within those. Indigenous fires tend to be small, patchy burns, but as a whole, when you add those up over the course of the year, they can encompass quite a large area. Some of the research estimates by Scott Stevens and others that these numbers can reach into about 4.5 to 12 million acres per year. The point is that no indigenous fires in pre-contact times would have reached to the scale of the fires that we're seeing today under wildfire conditions. And at the largest, indigenous fires might reach a few thousand acres, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 acres in size, which is basically looking at the scale from an individual plant all the way up to maybe a watershed. Whereas our wildfires, in some contexts, and think about the August complex in particular here in 2020, that's reaching the scale of an ecoregion. It's burning over 1 million acres, and it's impacting vast areas. So we have a choice. We have the opportunity to do something different. And I think about that in the context of what we in many tribes in Central California are working to do, and that is reclaiming a culture of fire. And through my research with Christine Erickson back in 2014, where we interviewed traditional cultural practitioners throughout the state to look at what the knowledge base of burning is and the practices, we have this one quote that I'll say here. Indigenous cultural burning practices are distinguished from other fire management, meaning prescribed burning or firefighting, in the context of traditional law, objectives, outcomes, and the right to burn. And by traditional law, what I'm referring to is going back to that creation story, the first fire story, and the stories that come subsequently that tell us that we need to be burning within our landscape. And that's the basis of our knowledge and the basis of our way of burning. So when we think about those opportunities and reclaiming that, it's about intergenerational processes to teach our young people and also working with the older people, our elders, to facilitate stewardship within our landscape. And this is happening across the state within many different tribes. In thinking about, the approach of how we go about putting fire back into a landscape, we need to be thinking about the appropriate scales at which fire should be occurring. We need to think about what the goals of those burns are, the how, the where, the when, the what, the why. All those things are part of it. But our success criteria should be based on very specific things. Maybe it's based on an abundance of species. And from a cultural perspective, I like to think about what I'll call ecocultural species. Maybe we're thinking about condors, maybe we're thinking about salmon, or maybe we're thinking about acorn woodpeckers and their abundance within the landscape. And if those species are plentiful, then maybe that's an indicator of our success. Or maybe just the criteria of being met, could we possibly live in a place that we've been stewarding? And so we have opportunities to think about how we would approach putting fire back into these areas. And it's important to recognize that, yes, environmental change has happened. It's always been that way. Climate change has always occurred. We've had long periods of wet, we've had long periods of dry, going over centuries. And if we look at the paleo record for fire, we know that we can't recreate the past. We know that climate change has happened. And in the absence of indigenous fire for the last, say, 200 years, there's an important process that we can then interject back into our landscapes to steward for fire. So the ways that we have to be able to do that is to understand and read the parameters of our landscapes. And by reading the landscape, we have to understand the soils, we have to understand the vegetation, the climate, the social systems within that landscape, and the political factors. So thinking about reading the landscape for the right kind of fire, and largely for indigenous burning, I mostly focus in on plant phenology, so the condition of plants, and knowing when and how and where certain plants within the landscape are going to be more receptive to fire or more resistant to the spread of fire. And in this particular photograph, what I'm showing is a burn that was done up on Mallory Ridge in Contra Costa Alameda County line area that was set during the springtime when the live fuel moisture was very high. And burning at that time of year is very different than burning, say, during the end of summer or the dry season, where these plants are drought stressed. So when the fuel moisture is high, the ability for fire to spread through that system is going to be much more reduced. And so I'll get back to that in a moment, but knowing how and when to set fire is really important in the context of indigenous burning. And I'm going to take us through a couple of different ecosystems within Central California where indigenous fire has been taking place over the last 20 years. To begin with, I'll talk about riparian ecosystems because a lot of times we don't think about the role of fire within riparian ecosystems. And our riparian ecosystems in Central California in particular are among some of the most highly impacted ecosystems in our state, with less than 2% remaining. So these are rare ecosystems. And I started my research in fire looking at riparian ecosystems because I knew that these were traditionally stewarded by our ancestors' various outcomes. And I think about the rarity of these systems. So by using fire, we can protect these systems. And to highlight here, we've got burns in the summertime, we've got burns in the fall. They're all creating different outcomes, but under the wrong conditions, we can have wildfires. And on the far right, you see a fire that happened at the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge. It was a 1,500-acre wildfire back in 2004 that really had impacts on this landscape. Next, I'll talk about the chaparral and the chaparral communities and how we can burn within those systems using that understanding of fuel moisture differential and keeping our fires small to help to reset and rebuild the mosaic within the landscape. Next, our foothill meadow ecosystems, grassland ecosystems, and a lot of our foothill communities have been heavily invaded by yellow star thistle and invasive non-native grasses. And we can steward by burning at the right time of year, by thinking about the plant species that we have within these systems to restore them back to native species dominance. And I've been able to do that through my work at the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. And this is a meadow that's been burned 3 times. This photograph was taken in December of 2019, which was the most recent of those burns. But we've converted this from star thistle dominance to native species dominance. Same thing in our Valley Oak Woodlands, very similar process, restoring to protect the oaks, which are another rare ecosystem here in California, and maintaining and increasing our native species dominance. Very similar process within our Blue Oak Woodlands, and here we can see an area that's been burned and has recovering native grasses that are in the foreground, also dominating within the system. And lastly, our Black Oak Woodlands, the same process of being able to apply fire to steward for native species and increase native species dominance within these areas. All of these are examples of places where indigenous fire is being used, and these are indigenous fires and fires that have been set for those purposes. Indigenous fire takes place across the entire season. If we think about each ecosystem, there's very specific time frames for when fire should be put into them, and also how frequently fire needs to be put in to maintain the cultural objectives within those landscapes. So we've got a lot of different fire that's taking place across the state, and this map just highlights some of the areas with about 5 or 6 different communities in particular, including Amah Mutsun, North Fork Mono Tribe, my own Miwok folks, the Concow and Maidu folks in the Lassen and Sierra foothills, and also up in northwestern California with the Yurok, Hupa, and Karuk tribes in particular, leading the way with a lot of different types of fire. So these fires that we see, these wildfires, present an opportunity for us to step in, to re-steward places that are out of whack and now have had a correction. And so maybe these are the easy places for us to step back into. And this is a photograph from the Rim Fire in 2013 near Yosemite. I think about the opportunity that this fire in particular has posed, that we could come back in and steward for the fine grain mosaic and the chaparral. We can manage for our oaks. We can manage for our grasses. We can manage for the conifers. All of that is visible within this one particular photograph. So what tools do we have to be able to do that? Well, there's policy and management tools like the traditional gathering policy between the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. We've got self-determination, both on the federal government side and the state government side, and the Western Regional Air Partnership, which allows for and recognizes indigenous fire as a natural source of emissions. Our climate is changing, we recognize that, and there's opportunities within the fourth climate assessment report for the state to be able to make change. And in specific, we can think about resiliency planning and implementation of indigenous fire stewardship and carbon offset programs to support indigenous stewardship in the state. With that, I'll bring it to a close, but if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you and have a good day.
Wow, thank you so much for recording that video for us, Dr. Hankins. There was so much information in there, so I'm really glad that we have a video to refer back to, and also that study that referenced 73 reasons why California Indians burned. That was just incredible. I know that there are a lot of reasons, but I had never thought to quantify it in that way, and I really appreciated that. So thank you again to all of our panelists. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope you all did too. And I'm going to speak now about the Amah Mutsun Land Trust and the work that we are doing. And I'm just going to start my screen share here, which is the cruxiest part. Let's see. And start my slideshow. Okay, and just a time check, we might go just 5 minutes over, but we won't keep you here for too long, so please hang around if you can. So as I shared in the beginning, my name is Sarah, and I'm the Interim Executive Director for Amah Mutsun Land Trust. I'm not a member of the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, but I've been working with the Amah Mutsun for over 10 years, and I've worked for the Amah Mutsun Land Trust since its inception. I have a master's degree in range management from UC Berkeley and a background in ethnobotany and restoration ecology. But I'm not here to talk about my research. I'm here to talk about Amah Mutsun Land Trust's work to revitalize indigenous cultural burning. Since the time of fire suppression policies that prohibited the Amah Mutsun from using fire, Amah Mutsun tribal members have been keeping their relationship to fire alive in other ways. Some tribal members kept traditional fire practices alive, like starting fire with a hand drill. You can see a photo of this here in the slide, and using sacred fire in ceremonies. Others have worked in state agencies like CAL FIRE, and others are in the process now of relearning indigenous fire traditions. Amah Mutsun Land Trust is supporting the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band in these relearning efforts through our Emerging Cultural Burns program. First, I just want to give you some background information about what Amah Mutsun Land Trust is, what we do. So Amah Mutsun Land Trust is one initiative of the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization created to serve as a vehicle for the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band to access traditional lands and resources and restore indigenous stewardship practices. Chairman Lopez has explained in the past that the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band is not currently a federally recognized tribe. The tribe owns no land, they don't receive money from the federal government, and most tribal members live over 3 hours away from their ancestral lands. They live in the Central Valley primarily. Furthermore, the tribe endured 3 successive waves of colonization, which intended to wipe out the Amah Mutsun history, people, and culture. So facing these circumstances, you can imagine how difficult it is for the Amah Mutsun to maintain their sacred obligation to Creator to steward the lands of their ancestors. This is where Amah Mutsun Land Trust comes in. Through Amah Mutsun Land Trust, the Amah Mutsun can enter into partnership agreements, such as Memoranda of Understanding and co-management agreements, to regain access to ancestral lands. The tribe is using the Amah Mutsun Land Trust to secure a seat at the table in negotiations around land use and management. Through the Amah Mutsun Land Trust, the Amah Mutsun tribal band can acquire land within their ancestral territory. Amah Mutsun Land Trust does not own land yet, but this is a goal that we are working towards. And finally, because Amah Mutsun Land Trust is a nonprofit, we can accept grants and individual donations that are used to support the Indigenous stewardship work of the Amah Mutsun. We are a Native-led organization, starting with a board of directors, which maintains a tribal member majority. And while we have a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff, almost 75% of our staff are enrolled members of Native American tribes. We are a rapidly growing organization, and I did want to mention that we're currently hiring for our next executive director. So if you or someone you know has the skills to join us in this important role, please visit our website for more information. So this is a map of our stewardship area. Amah Mutsun Land Trust is bringing Indigenous stewardship to the ancestral lands of the Mutsun and Awaswas speakers, which are represented roughly in this map. Our stewardship area stretches from Año Nuevo Point to the Monterey Bay and inland to include the Pajaro and San Benito watersheds. So we're working in Santa Cruz, San Benito, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Monterey counties. Within this area, we've established partnership and land use agreements that give the Amah Mutsun access to over 100,000 acres of land for Indigenous stewardship and cultural relearning efforts. And here I've pasted our vision statement. I'll also speak a little bit more about each aspect of our work in the following slides. So research and education. Due to the impacts of colonization, a lot of traditional ecological knowledge was either lost or went dormant. Today, the Amah Mutsun are working to relearn traditional ecological knowledge so they can restore their role as environmental stewards of their ancestral territory. Collaborative archaeological research, as described by Dr. Lightfoot and Dr. Cuthrell, is one tool the Amah Mutsun are using to restore knowledge about how their ancestors were managing the landscape. Research is a strategy that the tribe has used to not only relearn traditional ecological knowledge, but also measure what happens when you apply traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous stewardship practices to the landscape today, which is much different than it was 250 years ago. At Pinnacles National Park, for example, the Amah Mutsun participated in a habitat restoration experiment, which tested the impacts of Indigenous tending on 2 native plant species used for basket weaving. In that experiment, Pinnacles and the tribe conducted a cultural burn to manage a stand of deer grass, and they did this in an experimental fashion. This happened in 2011, and it was the first time in contemporary history that a cultural burn was conducted in Amah Mutsun territory. Amah Mutsun Land Trust brings an Indigenous approach to conservation and restoration. We currently hold 2 conservation easements, and we do habitat restoration work with a variety of partners at multiple sites within Mutsun and Awaswas territory. Amah Mutsun Land Trust is also committed to protecting and preserving Amah Mutsun's sacred and cultural sites. And I invite all of you to visit protectyurastock.org to learn more about the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band's campaign to protect Urastock, which is one of the tribe's last remaining intact sacred sites. It's being threatened by a proposed sand and gravel pit mining operation in Santa Clara County. And there is a petition at that website that you can sign to voice your opposition to that mining project. The heart of our work at Amah Mutsun Land Trust is really Indigenous stewardship. At Amah Mutsun Land Trust, we recognize that stewardship of conserved lands is a long-term problem in need of a permanent solution. We do a lot of work to bring active stewardship to lands already owned by the leading conservation organizations and public land agencies within Amah Mutsun territory. And our Indigenous stewardship work is implemented by our Native Stewardship Corps. The Amah Mutsun Land Trust Native Stewardship Corps is a conservation crew made up of Amah Mutsun Tribal Band members who are paid to implement the research, education, conservation, and Indigenous stewardship work to which our organization is committed. In 2021, we will have a crew of 8 to 10 Native stewards implementing 36 weeks of Indigenous stewardship work within Amah Mutsun and Awaswas territories. So now I'm going to transition into speaking more specifically about our cultural burn program. This is an emerging program, and it was born out of recognition by the Amah Mutsun tribal band that fire is sacred and that Indigenous cultural burning is needed to maintain balance on Mother Earth. Indigenous cultural burning is prescribed fire performed by Indigenous people that is informed by traditional ecological knowledge and confers a number of ecosystem benefits, which we've been hearing about and we'll hear more about. This is a photo and quote from Lawrence Atencio. He's our Native Stewardship Corps field manager. Lawrence is a member of the Oke-Owingeh tribe from New Mexico, and he's been a fire practitioner since 1996. In this quote, Lawrence explains some of the benefits of fire and also points out that cool, low-intensity broadcast burns, strategically done, are a powerful landscape restoration tool. This is a photo and quote from Marcela Luna, one of our Native stewards. All of our Native stewards are fire ready, meaning that they have current firefighter type 2 certifications and full PPE, and they already have some prescribed fire experience under their belts. Marcela mentions here how much she enjoys attending the Trex events. Each year, Native stewards attend prescribed fire training exchanges or Trexes, where they come together with an assortment of fire practitioners to put good fire on the land and expand their prescribed fire skills. So our Native stewards have participated in Trex events with the Karuk and Yurok tribes, also in the Bay Area. It's a really powerful event. One goal of our Cultural Burns program is to increase the amount of Trex and other training opportunities that are available to Native stewards so that they can continue to build their experience as fire practitioners. And this is a photo and quote from Alexi Sagona, who's a tribal member and a PhD student, and who works with Amah Mutsun Land Trust in the summers as an intern and most recently as a program assistant. And in this quote, Alexi is talking about the fuel reduction work that Native stewards are engaged in currently at Año Nuevo State Park and elsewhere in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This work is relying predominantly on chainsaws to manually reduce fuel loads in preparation for the restoration of broadcast burning in the future, which we want to do to maintain coastal prairie. And again, this is where we are taking the research that Dr. Lightfoot, Dr. Cuthrell, and others have done, we're turning it into stewardship actions. And I like Alexi's point here that he makes about how different it is to do coastal prairie restoration using machinery versus using fire. He says that fire is a mechanism to achieve the cultural revitalization and healing that is needed for his community. Alexi explains that when you even start thinking about doing a prescribed burn, you have to acknowledge and think about all of the relatives in that ecosystem. And that brings you closer to an Indigenous mentality of caring for the land. This intimate relationship with the land is one of the things that we are trying to restore with our Cultural Burns program. So Amah Mutsun Land Trust has been engaging with cultural burning for many years now, but this is the first year that we have dedicated funding to build a more robust and structured program. This is thanks to a 2-year grant from the California State Coastal Conservancy. With this funding, we're strengthening the relationships that we've built over the years with our diverse conservation and fire partners, like the Central Coast Prescribed Fire Council, the Bay Area Prescribed Fire Council, the Yurok and Karuk tribes, state parks, Audubon Canyon Ranch, Semper Virens Fund, Save the Redwoods League, and others. Plus, we're building new relationships with the Monterey Bay Prescribed Burn Association, which will have a name change in the future, but that's the current name. Also, the Intertribal Indigenous Stewardship Project and a new project, the SoCal State Demonstration Forest. So with our current funding, we're providing more training opportunities to our Native Stewardship Corps, and our goal is that Native stewards will participate in 36 days of prescribed fire over the next 2 years. We're also engaging with the public to promote the role of Indigenous cultural burning, as you are experiencing now during this symposium. Some of our immediate next steps with this program include securing additional funding that will help us grow and continue our cultural burns program beyond the life of our current grant. We also want to secure new funding to pay the Native stewards to help with fire recovery efforts following the CZU Lightning Complex fires. Our Native stewards are trained sawyers. They're trained in invasive species management, trained in wildland firefighting. They're hard workers, and they are ready to take on more work helping the community. And so we are looking for funding to support that work. We also need to continue to build our capacity to write burn plans and to understand what will be needed legally and logistically for Amah Mutsun Land Trust to be a lead organization in for future cultural burn efforts. All of this is building towards a future where Amah Mutsun Land Trust is in a leadership position for cultural burning in Mutsun and Awaswas territories. Our goal is to have the training and the staff and the organizational capacity in place to be able to respond to wildfires in our region. We also want to be able to help prevent future catastrophic wildfires by restoring cycles of regular burning to Mutsun and Awaswas lands. This is so important. We're considering the possibility of building up an engine crew so that landowners can contract with Amah Mutsun Land Trust to do prescribed burning and help reduce the fire deficit that the land is currently experiencing. And one day we'd like to lead an annual Trex event that takes place in Amah Mutsun territory and brings our partners together to put good fire back on the land in our area. Finally, we want to continue to learn from our tribal partners and deepen our relationship with other tribes doing cultural burning so that Indigenous cultural burning is restored throughout the state of California and beyond. So this is an emerging program. You have the opportunity to join us at the ground floor, and we need your help to meet these goals. The easiest way to join us is to go to our website and sign up for our email list. This is the best way to stay in touch and make sure that you receive notifications about future educational events like this one, plus opportunities to volunteer and other periodic updates about our work. If you have a question or an idea that you want to share with us, you can get in touch by sending an email to info@amahmutsun.org. And I'd also like to request that you consider making a donation to Amah Mutsun Land Trust. Your donations will help fuel our Cultural Burns program and allow us to meet our goals. You can donate on our website or through PayPal, or you can send a check to the address on the slide here. And if you really want to contribute to the sustainability of our Cultural Burns program, you can consider making a recurring donation through our website. Our monthly donors are some of our most powerful supporters because we know that month after month, we can count on you to walk alongside our organization in support of our vision. So if you feel strongly that what we do, if you feel strongly as we do, that there's a need for Indigenous cultural burning on the landscape in Mutsun and Awaswas territories, please take action today with a gift to Amah Mutsun Land Trust. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all learned something new today. Remember, you can find a recording of this symposium in the next week or so on our website, and please stay in touch with us by signing up for our email list or by making a donation. Thank you so much.